Okay, it is now my pleasure to invite the participants in Plenary 1 panel to come to the stage. Okay, we have quite a distinguished lineup here for our first panel discussion. Let me briefly introduce them before we move into the session. Immediately to my left, we have the Honorable Gregory Barker, the Minister of State for Energy and Climate from the United Kingdom. We have Pak Heru Prasetyo, who is Deputy 1 of the Presidential Delivery Unit from Indonesia. We have Jonathan Horrell, who is the Director of Sustainability at Mondelez, who was graciously willing to step in for Gail Clintworth at very short notice. And last but not least, Peter Graham of Natural Resources Canada, who has been co-chairing the UNFCCC substantive negotiations on REDD+. But before I launch my questions to our distinguished panelists, we are going to have a special video message from Christiana Figueres, the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, who joins us by video.
Friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to the Minister of Environment of Norway for inviting me to address the Oslo REDD Exchange Conference. As we approach COP19, it is important to take stock of where we are with REDD+ and what we can accomplish in Warsaw, knowing that the forest sector plays a crucial role in climate action. Forests are significant. They cover about 30% of the Earth and store about 280 gigatons of CO2. According to the IPCC, deforestation contributes between 5.8 and 8.5 gigatons of CO2 emissions per year. And the latest report from the IPCC tells us one more key fact, that the window to meet the internationally agreed goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius is closing quickly. This means the global community, public and private sectors, civil society and communities, all must seize every opportunity to curb emissions in every sector, including curbing emissions through immediate action on REDD+. 2013 has been a pivotal year for REDD+. In Doha, parties agreed on a rigorous program of work for this year, with a focus on results-based finance and methodological guidance. This year's focus on finance shows that readiness is precursor to results. For funding to flow, inventories and monitoring must be in place, and transparency and accounting rules. Communities must be involved in decision-making, national governments must assess drivers of deforestation, and the international action is effective. The 2013 workshops under the UNFCCC process helped articulate the need for readiness and open the door for parties to act on finance in Warsaw. This year's focus on methodological guidance shows that full implementation of REDD+ at the national level is easier when developing nations develop strategy, address deforestation, and establish forest monitoring systems and inventories. These measures give countries an honest look at how forest resources contribute to development and emission goals. So it is in our best interest to empower parties to take these steps. Your conference is the next step in the approach to COP19 in Poland. It further empowers countries to prepare for REDD+ and furthers our knowledge on barriers to action. It provides results we need quickly and effectively. And the outcomes of this conference and this year's workshops will shape REDD+ success in Warsaw. Dear friends, as the international process to address climate change moves forward towards a new universal climate agreement in 2015, clarity across critical. We need REDD+ to send a signal that builds confidence to those working both inside and outside the process, that takes us closer to results-based actions and financing. This signal comes from bilateral and multilateral coordination, from civil society demonstrating activities that show public support and possibility for action, and from active participation that moves the international process forward. I encourage you, as a government or private sector leader, as an academic or as an activist, to redouble efforts to achieve enable low-carbon development. Preserves biodiversity, protects indigenous rights, water and soil, and gives them the gift of healthy forests. Now is our opportunity to add REDD+ to the growing array of options that we can use to shape a future we are proud to pass to our children and our children's children. I wish you much success. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to get into the panel, and what I'm going to do is ask each of our panelists a first question to give them a few minutes to warm up and share some insights with us. Have a few follow-up questions, and then I'll start getting some cards from you in the audience or from tweets and try to mix it up a little bit and have some good discussion before we move to the first coffee break. So, Minister Barker, I'm going to start with you. As I said in my opening remarks, the failure to come to an agreement in Copenhagen sort of dashed our hopes for near-term, large-scale payment for performance REDD. And there's been a source of disappointment, since then that we haven't really gotten back to where we needed to be. And in fact, I heard someone say the other day that REDD is dead or at least on life support. Now, what do you see as the state of play on REDD+ negotiations and finance? And can you give us some reasons for optimism?
Sure. Well, first of all, can I say that was a very innovative, interactive opening speech that we just had from Christiana Figueres. I think putting postcards on the audience seats and inviting them to fill in the blanks of Christiana's speech is a great innovation. And maybe we should have a vote at the end to decide what she should have said. But could you just keep it clean, please? No, that's great. In terms of being here in Oslo, is very special to me because I was elected into government in 2010, and I came here literally 4 or 5 days after taking office when David Cameron formed his government in Britain in May 2010, and that was in the immediate aftermath of the car crash at Copenhagen. So the UN conference here in Oslo in spring really was the morning after the night before. And it was striking then that actually forestry was one of the few things that was seen as positive coming out of Copenhagen. And there was a degree of optimism that for all of the other failures to agree on tangible progress, ambitious steps forward at COP15, that actually forestry was going to be one of those areas where we could make tangible progress, and the vehicle for making that tangible progress was REDD+. And I came away from that conference in Oslo really rather encouraged that in the absence of a global treaty, there were practical things that we could do, and we could really get our teeth into meaningful forestry programs. Now, it is disappointing that the progress that we hope to make in the years after 2010 has in many ways failed to materialize, certainly at the pace and scale that we hoped for then. But it's not a completely barren landscape. There has actually been some progress. It's absolutely true. It has proved much harder on the ground to deploy funds into programs at the pace and scale that we had hoped for. But there has been a degree of progress. We have to recognize that delivery is difficult. It is complex, that having a universal set of guidelines and rules are one thing, but the way that they are implemented on the ground varies very much from nation to nation, and we have to take into account individual circumstances in country. But there have been real successes. I think what's happened in Brazil, although we shouldn't underestimate the large part in which that is due to national rather than international cooperation. But nevertheless, we should celebrate as a global community the extraordinary strides forward that there have been in Brazil. And I'd also pay tribute to what's happened in Indonesia, where I think there has been genuine progress, and we are keen to partner more. And I think there has also been a greater sense of buy-in from the private sector. Now, we've got to do more to put flesh on the bones of what that's going to do in terms of translating to real action. But I think it would be fair to say, yeah, we haven't delivered at the pace and scale we hoped for, but we shouldn't be too down in our cups. There has been real progress. A lot of people in this room, actually, have been putting in a lot of effort into creating the delivery mechanisms, to working on the unglamorous technical side of delivery, of making sure that the programs are properly constructed, have the right governance, and have the right technical qualities. These are the absolute prerequisites of long-term success. So I think, yep, it's taken longer, but I think we have come on. We are ready now to force the pace of change and go up a gear, and I hope that there will be some good news coming forward in Warsaw, and that 2014 will see us go to the next stage.
Thank you very much. Heru, I'm going to go to you next. So we've heard a perspective from an industrialized country, and we'd like to hear your perspective from a forest country, and certainly a very important one. It'll come on as soon as you start talking, don't worry. Okay. They've got it, they're keeping track. And especially I'd like you to put on your hat as current co-chair of the REDD Plus partnership. And we understand there was recently a meeting of the partnership in Palangkaraya. And so you can speak from both your Indonesia, but also your broader standing in that community.
Thank you, Francis. I think I'll take the challenge of Minister Edwards in terms of filling the blank of what Christina has said. I think one thing that is very important and missing in the last part, I will try to use this sentence: to empower parties to redouble actions for sustainable forest management and low carbon development. Last words of Christina, if I'm not mistaken. And then earlier, she also mentioned that readiness is the precursor to results. And readiness being the precursor of result means that the forest countries needs to do a lot of inventory and monitoring, transparency and accountability, community is being respected, national assessment of what is a driver of deforestation, and also that international must be confident that this can be done. I think those are the filling the blank that I'm trying to do for Christina. I hope they will come out and see whether that is spot on or less than spot on. But okay, one thing that I would like to start with from that perspective, Francis, is in terms of that to empower parties to redouble action for sustainable forest management and low carbon development. Think about it. This is a pragmatic approach, but also go beyond emission. Because you're talking about sustainable forest management, you're talking about the low carbon development. So development and REDD Plus are actually two sides of the same coin. I think that is very important. With that basic conditions, I would like to submit that in my unlearned kind of perspective, I will say that climate change and also REDD Plus is an effort that was triggered by the scientists. I would like to contrast that with Industrial Revolution that was actually driven by technology development. If technology development drives Industrial Revolution, that starts from local moving to global, and then we now reap the benefit of them, but also the peril of having a global climate change. Now the scientist has created a countercurrent of that and say, look, We have gone too far. We need to get back to where we need to be from global to local. And so the move from the Industrial Revolution is now being corrected. What was right is being corrected by these scientists. So I would like to congratulate science for being able to drive all of us to the right directions today. And what has been discussed during the UNFCCC discussion was actually leading or following that path that the scientist has given us, which is also very encouraging. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the forest is not where most of us live, right? Who of us live in the forest? Who of us in this room actually breathe the forest fumes, so to speak? Not many of us. As such, that forest to us is mostly like somewhere out there for us to either conquer or for us to care, right? And we have moved into that direction, which is the right direction, to care for the forest. I would like to show you a picture that is actually very vivid. Can you please show that slide that I have here?
It's up.
This is 1997. In 1996, Indonesia declared that for food security, we need to open 1 million hectares of peatland to plant rice. The project failed heavily. In 1997, you see the smoke and the ozone that was affected by the smoke of the peatland. That is global. And that is because of the decision of a country to do something ill-guided or misguided or unguided or perhaps neglecting the advice of the scientists. Now, if this is the situation, then we go to a more practical level now. Establish that this REDD Plus and climate change is a truly global phenomenon that we need to address globally, as the minister has mentioned earlier. So if we are trying to do that, we will see a reduction of emission as a result. And the forested countries are actually the result-producing part of the equation. And if the result of the forested country is actually the result-producing part of the equation, then where is what we call now the support provider country? I will not submit that this is just a support providing countries. They are the co-producer of the results. So you're talking about result producing and co-producers of result, because we don't want that to happen again. We don't want that picture that is in the screen to happen again ever, because that is disaster. So if we are talking about this result producing and co-producer of results, then we would like to see that there are issues of public fund, there are issues of private investment, and there are issues of market facilitation. Talking about that the public fund, I would like to comment what has been done by Norway, that public fund is not just money. Public fund is a statement of confidence that it can be done. President of Indonesia, when declaring 41% reduction of emission, is putting a bet on something that we will call above $10 billion effort. And when Norway say, I will contribute 1 billion out of that 10 billion, it's a very strong political commitment. And that very strong political commitment is now translated into work. Why it is so strong? Even if the amount of money that is being spent now is little, it's because it has that political impact in the country. The impact is like what has been mentioned earlier, the moratorium, the indigenous people involvement.
I'm going to stop you for a minute because I'm going to give you a separate opportunity to talk about the Indonesian
experience.
Thank
you, Francis.
So I don't want you to steal your own thunder for
Agree.
the next opportunity.
I like my thunder to be stolen here. Thank you.
I'll give it back. Okay, Jonathan, I'm going to skip you for a second and go to Peter. Now, Peter, Christina Figueres has given us a 40,000-foot overview of the state of play of REDD Plus negotiations, and mentioned that 2013 has already been a big year related to results-based finance and methodological guidance. Could you give us an insider's view, a little more texture and detail about what's going on in the state of play?
Sure. Thank you very much, Francis, and thanks to the government of Norway for inviting me, and also for their leadership on various aspects of REDD Plus over the years. It's been wonderful to see the engagement and the progress that they've helped to spurn. So, success of REDD Plus in the negotiations. I've been involved in the process since, well, in the REDD Plus since it was launched initially in Montreal in 2005, COP11, and it's been a remarkable process within a negotiation that moves at the speed of consensus of 180 some countries. And it's also moved in ways that are not necessarily as public or flashy at times, and I can understand why some might see that progress has not been made. Copenhagen looked like a failure, Doha looked like a failure, but for those of us in the smaller rooms, we have actually witnessed the progress. It's not pretty, it's not glamorous, but there has been progress made, and sometimes it takes a year to be realized and to come to light, and that's where I'm hoping we get to in Warsaw. One of the great things about REDD in the process has been the degree of support from all countries, all parts of the world. There's no disagreement on the value of reaching the objective. The disagreements come around with how exactly should we get there, what are we most comfortable with. Other parts of the success has been the involvement of civil society organizations, indigenous peoples groups, non-governmental organizations. If you've been to one of the COPs, you'll probably notice that the greatest crowd around the REDD Plus is around the REDD Plus meeting rooms, because that is the interest that we get. It's not always positive, but it's always productive and influential. The other great success from the negotiations that feeds the negotiations at its next session have been the initiatives that have been spawned over the years from various decisions. So major bilateral processes and initiatives, multilateral, as well as the actions taken by national governments and subnational governments as well that are related to decisions that have come out of the COP. So where are we now, to get to your question? We have arrived at a point where we're almost ready to finish what I would call the sort of methodological rule book for REDD Plus under the convention. From Copenhagen, where we did have a great success, a small but important decision on the methodological basis for REDD Plus, and then moving towards some really significant progress in Bonn just this past summer that will be hopefully realized in Warsaw. So that is guidance on modalities related to national forest monitoring systems, on the drivers of deforestation, on safeguards. And the two outstanding critical issues that we have are to provide further clarity on the rules and processes for assessing and reviewing reference levels, and the measurement, reporting, and verification processes and standards. The other side of the coin from the technical one is the finance, and that's been raised by my fellow speakers here. And it is a trickier one. We have had this process through a couple different channels this past year to develop clarity on the access to and provision of finance for REDD Plus. Now, this is all in the context, or most of it's in the context of access to results-based finance. The COP work program that we had a couple of workshops on over the past year have actually developed, I think, some significant points where we might find consensus for a decision. So I'm being very careful in my language here for Warsaw. And also, there's been a recognition that the financing for the readiness stage still needs to be recognized as a limiting factor in many countries. And so we're looking at ways to find words, to find action, to have that recognized in a finance decision related to REDD Plus in Warsaw. Now, key challenges to achieving success of the rule book and on the financing, I think, it's difficult to say. Obviously, the easiest way is to have all parties agree. But what does that agreement entail? It's on the verification side is a really difficult one at the moment, and that, I think, is going to require agreement on essentially the standards of verification, which will require a comfort and acceptance of the purpose of that process of verifying the results of a country's REDD+ actions in order to access results-based finance. The second part is on the financing one, and as I alluded to, that is more difficult because it is connected to negotiations that are much broader than REDD+. Two major channels for finance under the convention are through market-based approaches and through the funds, so the financial mechanism, which is right now the Global Environment Facility and the development of the Green Climate Fund. There's a lot of hope being put on the Green Climate Fund to deliver REDD+ finance, and it's in its mandate, essentially. However, its progress is not necessarily as speedy as we would like. Certainly from a REDD+ perspective, if they were up and going, it would make our job much, much easier, I think. So how is this going to play out?
Why don't you hold that and keep our attention for later in the, I'll ask you how it's going to play out later in the
Okay, I may change
session.
my answer before then.
Okay, good. All right. Last but not least, Jonathan Horrell, again, and thank you for being willing to step up to the last minute. You know, you've heard your fellow panelists talk about REDD finance and negotiations, and I think we've had one mention of the private sector by Minister Barker. But, you know, where is private industry in this picture, or are you guys in the picture at all?
Well, firstly, may I say, if anyone's surprised to see me up here this morning, you're not as surprised as I am to be here. So I hope to make some sense at least. I should say I work as Director of Sustainability for Mondelez International, and I expect it's worth explaining a little bit about who we are. We've existed since the 1st of October last year when we separated from the Kraft Foods Group. Mondelez International is now a global snacking company with a presence right across the world, leading presence in certain categories like chocolate, biscuits, also a very major player in coffee, gum and candy, and a few other categories. So this is very relevant to us. The majority of our environmental footprint comes from the agriculture that produces the commodities that we turn into our products. And many of those supply chains are from developing countries. Many of those commodities are linked to deforestation. Many of those supply chains also dominated by smallholders, as well as plantation agriculture. So this really matters to us. In terms of REDD+, well, what do I know about REDD+? Very good question. Almost nothing. It's an intergovernmental mechanism which has very little bearing on the private sector. Without there being, if you like, a model to engage business, then to an extent my answer to that question is, you know, to wish you luck. But, sorry, for the reasons I've explained about our commodity chains, actually, of course, you know, there is a huge shared interest here. So, as a rule, as a company, what we seek to do is to focus on what we're good at, which is developing, designing, making, moving, selling products to consumers. We're buyers of commodities. We're not growers of them. We don't directly own any agriculture. We don't even directly buy from a farm. The majority of what we buy is through supply chains with traders and first processors and so on. It's very tempting to say we should just return, you know, what we'd like to achieve at the end of this is a return to the past when we could simply buy and it would be delivered and we'd agree prices and volumes and so forth. But it's been clearly established, and I think we share that sense, that if not directly responsible, we are at the very least accountable for a lot of what happens in our supply chains. We need to share that accountability. So clearly, our consumers expect that of us. They expect us to manage these things well. It's not just the many stakeholders in this room, but it's ultimately the people that buy our brands. So, you know, we do have a role to play, but we can't do everything. We can't map origin countries. We can't establish land tenure. We can't do land use planning. There are many, many other things that we can't do. So clearly, in accepting our accountability, what we also have to do is recognize there are many opportunities to work together with others. We do things on our own account as a company. We can, in some commodities, we invest directly. Those tend to be commodities where we have a very major presence. where we are a significant proportion of those commodity chains, and therefore we can drive change at scale in our own right. Commodities like cocoa and coffee, where we've committed substantial sums. In other commodities, we have a much smaller position relative. We may still be major buyers, but we can't change the world, if you like, on our own. But we can signal our expectations, we can challenge our suppliers, we can engage our suppliers to help bring those things about. Palm oil is a good example of that. We've recently re-established a position in palm oil stating new expectations and committing to engage with suppliers around that. But also, of course, we can collaborate. We can collaborate within our own industry. We're members of an organisation called the Consumer Goods Forum. I imagine it's familiar to some people here. The Consumer Goods Forum has a resolution, a reasonably well-known resolution focusing on deforestation, committing to help achieve zero net deforestation by 2020. A fairly hairy and terrifying goal. It focuses on key supply chains, palm oil, soya, beef, pulp and paper. And a lot of work is going on to make that happen, or to try to make that happen. One of the key things that CGF recognised early on was that without a broader sense of collaboration, it's very good to collaborate as the private sector, but we need a broader-based collaboration to make things happen. And so fairly quickly, CGF moved to the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is a kind of grand collaboration. I guess many of us were in Jakarta for its first conference earlier this year. What do we want to achieve from that collaboration? Well, I think we should do some, we talk about in companies, we like to be optimistic. So we talk about glass half full, not glass half empty. I think we should recognise the benefits of collaborating well and work towards those benefits. We should focus on outcomes, not merely compliance with standards. We should recognise that change is needed at scale across entire supply chains, and therefore we really need mainstream solutions. There are plenty of niche options out there, but if we're really going to achieve the kind of scale that our ambitions match, then we need to do this right across supply chains. At origins, I think we need to recognise, to see the opportunity. Sustainable agriculture, we're always told, is more efficient. Therefore, it should enable origin countries to achieve their economic and development goals with a lower environmental impact. In the process, of course, that makes the commodities more attractive to buyers. But that transition does cost money, and it takes expertise. On the demand side, it's good to send a clear demand signal about what we're looking for. It's good, I think, for governments on demand countries to talk to their private sector partners about how to signal that demand. But I still think there is too much of this conversation happening here, maybe an opportunity for more of it to happen at origin countries as well. I think we should focus on the demand side, enabling origins to find their own solutions. We should provide that framework to support the transition, that framework in terms of finance and expertise that I mentioned. So to come back to the question, what do I know about REDD+? I do sense, although I don't understand much of what's been said about the detail, I do sense that there is a substantial opportunity for collaboration across all sectors, particularly if that collaboration can link REDD+ objectives to the commodity sectors that drive trade and development. And I think if we can do that successfully, then we can make a major difference.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just remind all of you, if you would like to jump into this conversation, write your question on a note card and hold it up, and somebody will find its way up to me. But I've got plenty of questions in my back pocket, so if you don't, I will. Okay, Minister Barker, you heard Pak Heru characterize the forest countries as the results-producing countries, and characterized ULOT as the support-providing countries. And I just, I can't help but ask that, I think of the UK government as a strong supporter of improved forest management and governance around the world for a number of years now. And yet, the UK hasn't yet followed the Norway example of putting up a significant amount of money on a payment for performance basis. Why not?
Well, you're right. The UK is one of the champions of supporting forest action globally. Like Norway. We were one of the first countries to come forward after Copenhagen with a commitment for Fast Start finance, £300 million, what's that, about $500 million, that we have actually deployed in the 3 years since 2010. So we are putting, firstly, our money where our mouth is, but why aren't we putting more money into results-based payment models? Well, firstly, we are. We think that the model that Norway has is definitely where we want to all get to. Results-based payment, it says on the tin exactly what we want it to do. But we have to recognize that in order to get to the point where we get a whole range of countries, new actors into the forest program, you can't just expect them to go from zero to results in one leap. And I think part of the learning for all of us over the last 3 years is actually getting good governance on the ground, getting effective management isn't easy. And those are the two prerequisites for payment by results. And so we have actually spent a lot of time, and it's not just about money, it's as much about effort and the very skilled intervention by our officials and NGOs in actually helping sometimes just individual communities on the ground actually put in place the basic framework for government and management that allows you to then track, audit, track, and monitor and verify the results that you're ultimately going to get paid for. And that requires know-how, it requires skills, it requires technical support. And so we have spent our significant amount of resource, both human capital as well as financial capital, in putting in place those frameworks that will allow us to then migrate to these results-based models. It's not so glamorous. It's not the sort of thing that you can put up in bright lights at conferences like these, but it is absolutely essential. And there's more work to be done. We're doing working with actors like Colombia, for example. We've done work in Ethiopia, but there are many more countries that we need to pull into the programs and get them on a footing whereby they can drive forward on a results-based mechanism. So more work to do, but results-based is ultimately where we all want to get to.
You're just asking me to be patient. Yeah.
Well, I share your impatience, and I beat up my own officials from time to time on why we're not getting there faster and at greater scale. But the inconvenient truth is you've got to put in the hard graft to have the framework there to begin with.
Well, and that's a perfect segue to fulfilling my promise to Pak Heru to let him come back to the Indonesia story, because I think there's more interesting to say about the political impact of having the payment for performance, what did you call it, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow to stimulate action. But also, back to my patience issue, why is it going so slowly in Indonesia, you know?
I expected that question. I expected that question, testing your patience, all right? But before that, I would like to support what Minister Baker said in terms of the need for the fundamentals to be done properly. And I would like to draw our attention to the role of the multilaterals, UN REDD, FCPF, and others. From the perspective of the REDD Plus partnership, we look into how the development of those capacity is being done through the country needs assessment. And we found out that the country need assessment that needs to be done by different countries are not all smooth. The problems are various in terms of the capacity to do the country need assessment themselves. So you're talking about the prerequisites to be able to do the prerequisites. Is actually not there. So I think it's very important that this mechanism of fund that is initial is to be channeled in a way that is more effective to be able to get the forested country, the result-producing potential countries, to really get into that platform so that they're getting easier to reach that pay-for-performance kind of a status. All right, but coming back to your questions, Francis, in terms of how it impact the government of Indonesia on that. That slide that I show was of 1997, of that big mistakes, and that was forest fire, peat fire that is happening so blatantly. Only in the year of 2007, right after COP in Bali, the president declared that we need to do a master plan to repair the $1 million US. And that master plan is now in work that is very much supported by that political support that we are getting from those arrangements, the letter of intent that we have with Norway. But having said that, we are talking about now the real driver is actually should come from the private sector. And this is something that I have not heard in the discussion, Francis. People are talking about driver of deforestation. Have we talked about driver of REDD+? Where is the private sector when you're talking about the driver of REDD+? And this is actually the place where ecosystem restoration projects, ecosystem restoration activity needs to be one of the focus of the private sector investment. That's why we call it the private investment instead of private reduction of emission. I am not saying that the need of what has been mentioned about corrective actions in terms of how we do the natural resources management so far is not important. That is a big part of the activities because the fate of the planet, okay, the fate of the planet is in the mercy of our lifestyle. So if our lifestyle can be changed, so the planet can be saved more. But on the other hand, 32 million hectares deforested area in Indonesia is not a small thing. We need to do ecosystem restoration. We need to do that very seriously. If the private sector fund can be used to help that ecosystem restoration projects, that is something that will be able to cross the sovereignty issues of countries because this is private investment. So I think I will say that for countries like Indonesia and others, all right, you have to identify the driver of REDD+, and I will submit one very important player is going to be the private sector. Now, you can be talking about a lot of billions from the public sector, but the private sector is key because that is how we redefine our lifestyle. Thank you.
Okay, let me segue on that to give Jonathan another chance to comment on anything that you've just said about the role of the private sector, but also to lob in a question from the audience. Someone wants to know, what does it mean when you say being accountable for your supply chain? What does that imply for transparency? I mean, is this the kind of thing where we need to know where your commodities come from to point of origin and what's feasible and who pays and all that good stuff?
Okay. To the first question, where is the private sector? I think one comment I have in recent years is that the private sector has tended to pursue things, often at great expense, which have been ring-fenced. And we talk a lot in the private sector about certified and segregated supply chains. And I think too often in pursuing that, we spend a lot of time and devote a lot of energy to doing things which fail to drive transformation at scale. And I would certainly say that we should work more closely together. We should work more collaboratively with origins because there are things that we can do each, and there are things that we can do better if we work collaboratively. So we think it's very important that if we're engaged in a commodity and a country, that we're engaged with the authorities there, where possible through some kind of public-private partnership platform. We're doing some work to support that in Indonesia around palm. We're doing the similar work in West Africa in cocoa, so that we can engage the private and public sectors and non-profit and other actors together in finding solutions collaboratively. So it's a very fair challenge in my view. Around being accountable for the supply chain and what does that mean for transparency? Well, at the moment, we're engaged in an activity. We've published our ambition around this to seek greater transparency about our palm oil supply chain by asking our suppliers to be able to tell us how much they can trace back to origin. That's a surprisingly difficult question to answer, and I think that's a shame. I think we need much greater transparency. I think a lot more of our focus needs to be on transparency, not necessarily for every consignment, every time, in every place, but we need to have greater visibility of the conditions in our supply chains so that from there we can prioritize actions.
Okay, thank you. All right, Peter, now I'm going to fulfill my promise to you to let you look ahead. And in particular, I remember one of the things Christiana Figueres said is that we need a signal that builds confidence. And I think that was perhaps referring to what's going to happen in Warsaw or not. And so maybe if you could look into your crystal ball and tell us what you think is going to happen and what would be the implication if nothing happens.
Sure. I think from what I've heard over the years, the signals are actually two signals, depending on who's listening. A signal to build confidence for implementing countries would be the signal of long-term, predictable, sustainable, adequate finance, should they choose to invest in a different development path that results in protection of the forests. The other signal, which is often for those that are looking at opportunities to support REDD+ activities through results-based finance, is a clear understanding of internationally accepted rules. So verification processes and all the accounting that goes in that. So it's a balance between the predictability and clarity on the finance and the transparency and accountability of the results.
Okay, while you've got the mic, don't put that down. I've got another question that I think goes your way. Here's someone who wants to know about, rather than going directly to payment for performance on reducing deforestation, what about the possibility of using proxies? So, for example, verified efforts to impact the drivers of deforestation. Is that something that's a ripe area for discussion?
Yes, that comes up. In terms of the climate convention, we are interested in essentially carbon dioxide emissions and equivalents. And so where proxies can be used that can have equivalent estimates of emissions in terms of carbon dioxide, there are options within acceptable methodologies to do that. But I think what we're getting at there is the incentive side. And on the drivers, we're looking at sectors outside of the forest. And in the development of REDD+, even as the acronym grew from RED to REDD plus others, it's still focused on the forest. However, we've recognized that in order to achieve results in the forest, you need to look outside at the drivers. This gets into this sort of, I don't want to get too technical, but in the negotiations, there's nationally appropriate mitigation actions that address all other sectors but REDD. And there are potential incentives for actions to address drivers through the agriculture sector, mining, other sectors, to reduce emissions through actions in those sectors. And so I think that's connecting those dots while we are in kind of two different silos right now in the negotiations. If we can look at the landscape in our negotiations and recognize that there are two potential sources of finance through different channels, the concept of proxies in that sense can function, I believe.
Okay, thank you. So, Minister Barker, back to you, and I've got two questions for you, so you can pace yourself. The first one is orienting off what Jonathan Horrell was telling us about the efforts and the commitments of the Consumer Goods Forum and then entering into a collaborative mode with the Tropical Forest Alliance. I confess that I find myself a little confused about what the value added is of the government participation in this alliance. You know, what is it that the consumer country governments bring to the table? And I also think I heard Jonathan make a passing reference to demand-side signals as being useful. And I don't know if you want to describe what your government has done or proposes to do on that side. Then as a separate, but I think complementary question is one that comes from the audience. There has been, we understand, a very large, several $100 million project under preparation of support from the UK for explicitly working with the private sector in rainforest countries related to both timber and agricultural sectors to, promote the green business models and slow down the less green ones. And there's an interest in the status of that commitment. And I'm later going to ask Jonathan Horrell to comment on this about, what's the role of public money in supporting private enterprise, and should we be concerned about that?
Thank you. Well, firstly, I think the UK is probably the leading advocate of the leverage that using public finance in a smart way can bring from crowding in private finance to be a major force for change for good. We see this right the way across the climate agenda, where there is this big figure. Another one of the positive things that came out of Copenhagen in 2010 was the commitment to mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020 from developed countries to developing countries. And real progress towards that target and commitment to meeting that target is going to be fundamental to building the confidence amongst all members of the UNFCCC, but particularly the developing countries, building that confidence that will allow them to sign up to an ambitious global deal in 2015. So we recognize in the UK that making your public sector funding pledges is vital, but it only is going to we're only going to reach the scale of ambition if we do so in a way that dovetails and leverages in private sector finance right across the piece. Now, the UK is in a good position to talk about that, because the problem is when a lot of developed countries talk about mobilizing the private sector or mobilizing private sector finance, what developing countries actually hear is, oh, hang on, they're wriggling out of their commitments on public sector finance or for public sector action. But in actual fact, the UK is the first of the G8 to meet its Millennium Development Goal of 0.7% of GDP being committed to development aid. And we're very proud of that fact. And in a significant proportion of that, an appropriate portion of that is in climate finance and support. So we understand the leverage that working with the private sector can bring, both in terms of finance, but also in terms of know-how and collaborative action. Now, in terms of forests particularly, we've said it's been pretty hard going to make the progress on the ground at the pace and scale we need to see. But we have seen progress, and where we see that we can leverage that progress is to target, not exclusively, but really have some focus and coherence to making sure that we work with the private sector on the ground, picking up with the private sector to ensure that there isn't duplication. We don't want to fund projects where there's the private sector impact can do that, but also looking to where they can't in country, and also making sure that we look to countries to create the framework, to create the conditions on the ground that allow the private sector to then go in. So I really do applaud the efforts that Jonathan and many companies like his are making, but we need them to go further, and we absolutely need total transparency in the supply chain. And given that the supply chain for forests is largely driven by SMEs, it is quite difficult to bring that degree of transparency. We need those large companies, those global players, even if they have slightly terrifying business descriptors like global snacking. I can't help thinking you've got to work on that description. We need you to really lead the pack to go beyond business as usual model, and to absolutely insist on total transparency. And I think if we are working in country with the private sector, you will get that leverage effect. But there will always be a place for publicly funded projects to go to those places, go to those sectors, go to those countries where private sector funding can't reach. And we don't shirk away from that at all.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to put this one to you, Peter. I've been kind to you up to now, so here's one from the audience. So, what is the role that markets will play in REDD+? Is offsetting ever going to be an option?
Yes, thank you for that one. I co-chair the technical negotiations and not the markets negotiations. All I can say is that the development of market-based approaches under the UNFCCC has made progress. That I can start with. Working with my colleagues who are involved more directly with that, they do see certainly a role for REDD+, and they also see that REDD+ has been pushing the markets negotiations. Essentially, if you get into at least those people who are really interested in the markets within the REDD world, they'll tell you, we know how it will work. And we try, or they try, and tell the markets people exactly how it will work. But that progress is a little slow because of the demand side, and that is related to the broader negotiations and perhaps the 2015 agreement. And so when we will get more clarity on the role of REDD Plus in the markets under the UNFCCC, that may have to wait until closer to 2015. However, we do see, my own perspective, other markets that are considering REDD Plus at larger scales, not just project scales. And I think that has led to a greater degree of comfort in how they might function within a broader market. And then, of course, the rules that we develop through the technical negotiations, if we can have internationally agreed standards, then it's much easier for the market people to accept those units within their systems.
Okay, thank you. Minister Barker, a quick one for you. Somebody from the audience points out that a lot of this commodity trade, and here are the references to the pulp and paper industry, remains illegal. And the question is, what are you doing to support governments to address the illegality problem as a driver of deforestation?
Well, as my terrific officials are fond of saying, the UK has led the world in illegal logging. By which I mean that we've led the world in cracking down on this practice. Certification, transparency, and going right the way through the supply chain. And I think actually the work that the Consumer Goods Forum through the Tropical Forest Alliance is doing is really carrying on some of the work that was actually started or led and opened up by the work that the UK has done with its certification. So we absolutely recognize the importance. The problem is, as I said in my last question, is actually easier to track this stuff when it's shipped through and delivered by the very large global companies who are often painted as the villains of these pieces, and in the past they have been. But in actual fact, good practice really has come on in leaps and bounds in recent years. It's more difficult in the less transparent, smaller mid-market to really drive through these codes of practice, and that's where transparency and certification is critical, and where the know-how that the UK has invested in and has helped spread is really critical. But I don't want to sound complacent. There's a lot more work we need to do.
Okay, so I'm looking at the clock when we're down to a few minutes, so I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to get to all of the questions that have come forward, but there's some good ones, and I'll commit to those of you who did take the time to submit them to pass them on to the moderators of relevant sessions over the next 2 days so that we'll get some discussion. But now I'm gonna challenge you to model what we're going to have to do tomorrow afternoon in the plenary when we do our voting exercise, where you only get to pick one thing. That's the most important thing. And I'm gonna start with you, Peter. So I have the impression from some of the things that you said that to a certain extent, REDD is hostage to progress in the broader negotiations, and we were going to have to solve some other issues and build some two-sided confidence before the large-scale finance comes through. What's the single most important thing that somebody in this room could do to liberate the REDD hostage through the negotiations?
Well, if you have control over your government's negotiation position, then that's certainly something can be done. I think political will is, it echoes throughout different parts of our discussion here. At a certain scale, if we want to accept REDD as a sort of early actor within a global agreement and are able to take a few chances with it, then political will be required to recognize that sooner than later.
Thank you. Jonathan, I'm going to let you say two things, but they're two different questions, so you still have to pick. What is the single most important thing that producer country governments could do to help you achieve your deforestation-free supply chain commitments? And what is the single most important thing consumer country governments could do to help you and the CGF meet that commitment?
Oh, the agony of choice. From a producer government side, I think the single most important thing is governance structure, to enable people to have confidence in supply chains and to enable transparency mechanisms to work. I think that can be really profound. From the consumer side, I think it's to participate in the change. We've talked about the need to finance a transition and enable a transition through expertise. I think if we can link REDD money to real commodity chains, then that gives us scope to bring in all manner of finance through the simple trade flows, because the origins become preferable.
Great, thank you. So, Pajero, you've obliquely alluded to things in your previous remarks, but now I'm going to ask you to put a fine point on it. What's the single most important thing you in Indonesia, and perhaps if you're willing to speak for other forest countries represented in the REDD Plus partnership, what do you need from the international community?
That is an ambush. Thanks, Francis. I think I'll echo the statement of Peter in terms of political will as very important in this sense, but not only will, but act as well, in terms of showing that it is really impactful. So showing it clearly such that it will provide impact in the national countries. Because right now, political will may actually be something that is very strong, and that is driven by the people, for the people, because government and other agencies are basically agents. When the people of the UK want something from the people of Indonesia, and the funds flow through that, we need to show that political will in a very strong way, such that the government of Indonesia act according to that political will message and work to the benefit of the people in the UK who ask a result from the people of Indonesia. So that is how I see that. But before I close, if I may, I would like to say that I have read two clear magazines lately. One is reread the September 2010 of The Economist, whereby it's called The World's Lung. And I think the next moderator, James Astill, is writing that Grantham awarded a prized article. I would like to quote one sentence that was mentioned there. It's from an Amazon Indian. He said, "Don't think that we Amazon Indians don't have cars. So we get the REDD Plus money, we are going to build roads." Imagine that REDD Plus does not end when we reduce emissions. Because when we involve the communities, then they want progress as well. So REDD Plus must be linked to development. That's number one. The second article that I've read is basically the time where you have Prince Charles in front to say the forgotten prince or something like that. But very small notes there. All around the world, marathon is one thing, right? So everywhere, you have the Boston Marathon, you have this marathon and that marathon. But the new trend, ladies and gentlemen, is vertical marathon. You climb the building like 46 floors through those small stairs, and that is the marathon that is in now. It's a trend moving forward. I think we, in REDD Plus, taking your sport example, Francis, we have done the marathon 42.3 kilometers. We are now moving toward the vertical marathon. I hope that Warsaw will provide the platform that we can do that. Thank you.
Great. Minister Barker, the last word is going to be yours. And your question is, what would you say is the single most important thing the international community should do to reinvigorate the REDD Plus agenda? And if you care to come back to Pajero, what's the single most important thing forest countries should do?
Well, I think, if I may abuse your moderation, I'll give three responses. I think there's something for donors, there's something for forest countries, and I think there's something for the community as a whole, which is probably the most important. Firstly, donors. We've come to pretty much the end of the the Fast Start finance period, we need more money on the table to show long-term viability of these projects. You know, forestry is nothing if not about the long term, and we can't expect forest countries to plan for the future with long-term programs if there isn't greater visibility around the finance. So we need to have that on the table. I hope we will be able to make some progress, significant progress at Warsaw on this, and certainly the UK intends to be part of that progressive move forward on the part of donors. And I salute, of course, the work that Norway has done and will continue to do in this area. But equally, the quid pro quo on the part of the forest nations is they've got to show greater ambition. We need new actors into this piece. We can't just rely on Brazil and Indonesia. There are a whole range of other important forest nations, and we need them to step up. Not just step up to take the money, but step up to actually deliver on the ground and really show a greater degree of commitment to governance on the ground. So that's what we need from forest nations. And then collectively, we've got to show that we can deliver. We've got to show that programs. We've got to instill confidence into this agenda by actually showing tangible results, tangible progress on the ground. Because if we can't do that, there is going to be rainforest fatigue. And I think we're close to getting to that point if we don't use this opportunity of this next COP to actually go up a gear in it. So I think we've got to make sure that we go in the right direction, and that is a responsibility of all of us to now go for it and show that we can actually deliver.
Great. Before I ask you to join me in thanking the panel, let me just say that we'll now close for a 30-minute coffee break. I encourage all of you to take advantage of the results bar offerings that'll be right outside the door. But please do come back and promptly be in your seats at 11:15, because we have a great second panel as well ready for that. But please join me in thanking our excellent panelists for a great start for the day.